In the lecture / live coding today, we're going to go over an example sort of data set that we have from a group that does sort of X-ray dynamic tomography. And so this is an aluminum foam animation. And so what we're looking at here is just one slice of the data set, which we can download here, that shows basically the evolution of an aluminum foam as it is heated up. And so we can see initially the structure is quite constant, and then some of the holes start forming, and then the holes grow, and a lot of the bubbles sort of combine together to form sort of larger bubbles. And so what we have is sort of the whole time series, and we see that there's a fair amount of sort of jitter motion involved in the evolution. Initially there's not very much going on, and then as time goes on, more and more goes on. And so we'll cover sort of how you do the pole processing for this and what tools you use. So here we'll have a notebook. I won't type in all the code from scratch because that would take too long, and I'd make too many mistakes. But here's the sort of the basic idea we have. So we use a library here called OpenCV, which is a very common computer vision library. It's open source, and it allows us to read in AVI movie files, which sort of scikit image and the other Python tools we use do not allow. So that's the principal reason for that, but we'll do all the image processing using sort of the standard scikit image plots that we've shown before. We have then some settings to make sure the plots look reasonable and to have progress bars, but ultimately nothing too surprising or very different from our earlier lectures before. What we have here is a sort of helper function that we write to read in the video files. And so OpenCV, because it's originally sort of a C-based library, deals with resources and processing in a very different way than most Python tools. And so what this does is it basically lets us encapsulate all of that OpenCV code into one block, where we get as an output the timestamp and the frame for each point. And so basically it gives us something called a generator, which is what this yield command means, that it doesn't execute anything immediately. So we can define this function, and then we can define this here, and we see that we have a generator object video to frame. And so what this is an object that has the video inside it, and we could read the video one frame at a time, and then it will move on to the next frame after we've read it. And so the basic idea is that this allows us to read in all of the video quite easily without having to worry about all of the problems of reading, checking to make sure it's not empty, releasing video resources, and everything else. And so this makes our life just fairly simple. Here we can read in a frame. We see that it works. Now what we want to do is read in all of the frames. So we use this notebook progress bar, this TQDM, which allows us to kind of keep track of how many frames we've read in. And so we can go through the whole video, concatenate it all together into one giant list, and then we'll use some of the NumPy tools in order to kind of combine it together. One of the nice features of Kaggle is that we can see how many resources we're using at the moment. So we can see how much memory is available, how much CPU we're using, if we're using a GPU or not, and how much storage we're using. And so here we can now combine everything together. So rather than having a long list, we can have a three-dimensional array for the frames themselves, and just a one-dimensional array for all the timestamps. And so this makes it quite a bit smaller and easier to deal with. And so here we can visualize all frames, so we use the montage function to sort of combine all the different tiles into one view and make sure that it's sort of read in correctly and looks reasonable enough. These : 2 and : 4 mean skip by 2 and skip by 4. And so basically the first one says only include every other frame. This says only include every fourth pixel in X direction, and this says only include every fourth pixel in Y direction. And so it makes the image smaller so that we can actually see everything in it. So now we want to do sort of the image enhancement. And so here we use the SciPy tools. So we want to perform a median filter to kind of minimize the noise and artifacts that we have, and then zoom to downscale. And so we give it the parameters for the median filter, where we basically include 2 pixels or 2 pixel size in the frame direction, and then 3 in the X and Y direction. And so what that means is that a window size of 5 and 7, respectively, are being where the median of each one of those windows is being taken in order to calculate the next frame. Once we've cleaned up the images, we then do a downsample. And so the 1, 0.5, 0.5 means that in the time axis, which is the first one, we keep it the same length, so we don't want to get rid of any frames. But in the X and the Y axes, we want to downsample the image by a factor of 2. So have half the number of pixels, just so that we can process it quicker and do other steps. And after we've done the median filter, we've removed a lot of the really small, tiny features anyways. And so having a smaller image makes it quicker for us to work with. This takes a little while to run because the median filter is quite time-consuming, particularly on a reasonably large image. So when we go back up here, we see the size of it, that it's 300 by 143 by 1443 by 1371. So if we do 300, that's 595 million pixels that we need to process. So if you think that, a nice digital camera maybe makes a 20 or 30 megapixel picture, this is significantly larger than that we have to all process together. And furthermore, we're looking at sort of 3-dimensional filters that we're applying to it. And so it has to go through not just the data in sort of one slice, it has to go through all the slices in order to kind of filter things well. We'll note as well that we see the CPUs at 100%. That might seem like it's good, but this machine actually has 4 cores, and so it could be as high as 400%. And so we're actually not using all of the resources available to us because the code hasn't been parallelized. So using tools like Dask Image, or Dask in general, Dask Image for sort of the more specific image processing tools, and other tools would make it a lot quicker to do large-scale image processing. And so if we go to sort of Dask Image, we can see the image processing tools that they have and sort of what's available for them. And so here, there aren't very much documentation there. Maybe this page is better, where we can see quick start. But yeah, that we get ImRead and defilters, and we can perform these more complicated analyses on images quite easily. So we now see that the first step is finished, and we've also used up almost all of the memory. And so now the next step is just doing this downsampling. And so that, again, is still only using 1 core, but should be much faster because ultimately your output image is much smaller, and the downsampling is a much quicker operation than a median filter. Because for a median filter, you really have to go through every frame one at a time in order to do it. So this RAM window is quite important for us to watch, because of course once it gets close to 16 or hits 16, then the kernel crashes. So we run out of memory on the machine and we'll have to kind of start over. And so we want to keep that as small as possible. We can now use tools in Python to kind of manage the memory a little bit more precisely, although these tools only are sort of suggestions. They don't actually force memory to be cleaned up like you would in languages like C or C++. And so here what we do is we import GC, which is the garbage collector. We then delete FrameVec because we don't need the unfiltered data anymore. And we run GC collect to sort of force it to clean everything up. And so we see now the RAM usage is even lower, and it takes a little bit of time to update, but we can clear up the memory to make sure there's plenty of space available for us to do further analysis. So now we're down to 1.7 gigabytes. So it gives us a lot more freedom to do these more interesting steps. And so here we can see the filtered image. We haven't really lost any obvious structure. It does appear to be slightly less noisy. And so now what we have to worry about is segmentation. And so this is kind of the, we've cleaned up the data, we've done the third lecture, which is sort of image enhancement, and now we're looking at how can we segment this data better. And so we can first of all use this try all threshold approach, where it tries all the different thresholds on all the data, and that we can see, for a slice at the beginning, a slice in the middle, and a slice at the end, how well did it work? And so this gives us a pretty good idea of how the sample changes over the course of the sample, and some idea of, what filter might be appropriate for all of the slices. And so we see here the original one works fairly well, but sort of triangle and yen end up giving us sort of these edges as well, and so we probably don't want to segment them. So probably triangle and yen we should avoid. We look at sort of the middle one, and we see triangle segments way too much. We want to see some holes in the image. And ISO data might not quite segment enough, so maybe the image is holier than it needs to be. And then original, when we look at sort of the last slice here, we have sort of these triangle, again, filling up all the holes, which is not something we want. Yen making the bubbles quite a bit smaller than they used to be, and mean doing a fairly good job of sort of segmenting what I would have called the bubble structures in the images. So of course, if you have ground truth, you know something about the size of the bubbles, or you are able to kind of judge the images very well yourself, you're able to go through this process. If you can't do that, it makes it a lot more difficult. So now we can apply this to sort of every slice in the image, and then we can try applying it to the whole image at once. And so basically what this will show us is when we use this automatic filter approach, do we have to use it on every slice? And how does it vary if we do it once on the whole image or on a slice-by-slice level? And so we see these green lines represent all the different slice level thresholds that it picked. And this blue line shows us sort of if you give it the whole image where it picks. And so we see the whole image one fits quite nicely in the middle. And that if you look at the distribution over the all the points of the data set, there doesn't necessarily appear to be a particularly intuitive, better point to pick. And so it's, picking somewhere that appears to be reasonable enough, probably isn't quite perfect, but works fairly well. And so now what we can do is we can try to apply the threshold to the whole stack, or frame by frame, and sort of compare the results. And so because we're dealing with sort of an X-ray method, we have an approach that should be fairly consistent in intensity, but obviously there are fluctuations. And so if we can use the same threshold on all the images, it means we're less likely to have sort of these undulating artifacts because the threshold method is responding to a slightly different region of the histogram, or the noise in the histogram moves a little bit. And so we'd prefer a whole image threshold if they look similar. And we can look at these images and say they look almost identical. Potentially this image here, you start to see the holes a little bit before you see it there. But other than that, they're very, very close. And so there's no reason to look at that in any more detail. And so now we can just apply that threshold. And that happens fairly quickly. And now we have the challenge that we found the aluminum structure, but we're actually interested in looking at the bubbles. And so if we want to look at the bubbles, then we have to try to find kind of what's the opposite of the aluminum structure. And if we go back to these images, we could take the opposite by itself, but that wouldn't tell us very much because the opposite is also all of the air outside of the aluminum. And so we want the opposite that's still inside the aluminum. And so here we can use that operation called the convex hull that we covered before. If you don't remember, it's worth going to the Wikipedia page to review it briefly. And you can see that the convex hull is just sort of, for a collection of points, the convex shape that contains, the smallest convex shape that contains all of those points. And so it gives us the ability to quickly create sort of a boundary for this object without requiring a whole lot of assumptions or complicated models. And it's already implemented very well in scikit-image. And so we can run this. It takes a few seconds because it has to run on every slice first. And then we just take the difference of the convex hull and the bubbles, and and the aluminum, and we'll see kind of where all the bubbles form. So we can tweak that again. Sorry, there's a typo in the code. But this is the hull, so this is sort of where the aluminum should be, and the bubbles are then everywhere the aluminum is, minus the bubbles, times sort of the aluminum structure again, because you don't want to get anything outside of it. So here we see it works fairly well. In the initial frames, we have some sort of boundaries around the edges that we probably don't want, and then we have sort of this outlier point, which causes us to get this whole triangle in the image. And so we can use some of the morphological operations to kind of clean up the aluminum image before we put it in, and then clean up the bubble image a little bit when we get it out. And so here we have this convex hull on the... So the first thing we have is the erosion on the aluminum image itself with this 3x3x3 ball. Then we have the convex hull. And then we have another erosion on that convex hull. And so we basically want to shrink the size of this aluminum structure as much as possible so that we don't end up with all of those sort of extra frames. And so here we can run it again. This one takes a little bit longer because it's now got 2 3-dimensional erosions that it needs to do. And as I should have mentioned before, all of these parameters were sort of found by experimenting and tweaking and looking at the results, but you can use different operations, different filters, and see what works well. And so here I used erosion instead of opening because we're not necessarily concerned about preserving volume. So we want the bubble volume to be preserved, but we're not looking at the aluminum hull volume. And so if that gets smaller, that's not really a problem for us. We might lose some of the bubbles at the edges, but the bubbly at the edges are going to be quite difficult for us to analyze anyway. So if we go back to the initial image we had here, you can see some of the first frames had like bubbles here, but I'm not sure we can actually do much with those bubbles. And so we at least initially will ignore them and maybe at some point go in more detail with that. So this operation should be almost finished. Perfect. So now we have the segmented bubbles image where we have a few little artifacts, but in general, we see just the bubbles that we want to see. We now have a 300 by 722 by 686 image, so it's quite a bit smaller. And we can use imsave to save this 3D image because this will be the basis for the rest of our analysis. And so it's quite helpful to have this image in sort of original form so we can go back to it and sort of understand why other analysis might work or might not work well. The main thing is we have to convert it to 8-bit in order to save. So right now it's a binary image. And if we try to save a binary image, imsave will say it doesn't really know what to do. So we can try that here. We run it, and it says sort of a weird error message. And so here we can just convert it to binary, and then it works just fine. We can now work with actually trying to label the bubbles. So we've saved our nice segmented bubbles, and now we sort of want to do a labeling and a tracking and everything else on them. And so the first thing we can do is just try to label every bubble. So we can use the label function to label every frame together. This works quite well, but we have the problem that there's a lot of shifts that go on to an image and a lot of bubbles that are kind of connected together. And so we can see here that, here are all the different bubbles that were found. Some of them are very, very big. This is on a log scale. Some of them are very small. So we can make a plot of sort of the object size. And we see that, there's a lot of very, very small, probably like almost single frame, tiny bubbles, and then there's a few very, very large bubbles. And so we can show an image of this where we see the segmentation and then the bubble labels on the other side. And so all of these purple bubbles are connected together because if they're touching in any frame, they end up touching in all the frames. And so we want to make sure they're as disconnected as possible. So now what we do is, rather than trying to label the whole set of bubbles at the same time, we do it one slice at a time. And so here we make some sort of fairly basic dummy functions that allow us to sort of do the shape analysis and extract the values easily. So don't worry about exactly what's in this code. This just sort of makes it easier to use, and the next versions of scikit-image will have this built in. But this just lets us make a sort of data frame out of what we're doing. And so here we have the label and region props, and basically what we do is we run label on each slice, and then we run region props on all the sets of labels. And so we end up with all of the bubbles from every frame being labeled. We then use this sort of messy code here to combine everything together. But what we'll see is that we get a nice table at the end that has all of the frames and bubbles inside it. And so it'll give us all the labels, all of the bubbles, and then we can process that however we want. And so it takes a few seconds to run because it has to go through all the bubbles first. We use the clear output function in Jupyter to clear all of the error messages and noise away, because we don't want to disable the messages. We just don't want them kind of ruining our output when we know they're going to be there anyways. So here we clear the output, and then we show a few rows, and we can see for each bubble we get the centroid, the convex area, the eccentricity, the extent, the label, major axis, minor, orientation, perimeter, everything we could want for that bubble. We can then make sort of a histogram, or what are the bubble sizes. So we see the largest ones are sort of 600, 700 in size, and the smallest ones are, below 25 in size. So then we add the x and the y. So we have to take the first value of the centroid for x and the second value of the centroid for y. And then we save it to a CSV file that's easy for us to open in Excel or other tools. And then a JSON file, which is easy for us to continue with in Python. And so you can use either. JSON's generally a bit more structured, and so things will get transferred better. CSV will end up turning a lot of these sort of multiple parameter sections like local centroid into just a string, and so that can make it harder for us to work with it. Also, sort of some of the inertial tensor stuff might get lost, and so if we want to use that again, it's easiest for us to save it as a JSON format file. And so now what we can do is we can sort of do some simple plots. So we keep all the big points. We can see sort of all the points in the image for all time steps, so that's not particularly helpful. We can then use Plotly Express, which is a nice web-based plotting library that lets us kind of interact with our plots, where we take, again, all the bubbles bigger than 50. And show them. So commit this, so it'll run all the code and save it. So now we have sort of the first frame where we don't see very much, and that we can sort of play forward. We still don't see very much, and that's because the scales don't really make sense. So there's 628 to 629. 374 to 375. And so we can click here to auto scale, and then we can go back to the beginning and sort of play the whole animation. That we see the bubbles in every frame, and sort of how they move. It doesn't do a very good job because we haven't tracked them at all yet, so it's just showing them in their size. And so, yeah, we can see the bubbles, that there's more and more bubbles. Eventually they'll start consolidating and joining together. And that, clearly this video doesn't have much to do with this video here. That all of these sort of weird dances aren't actually happening. That's just how it puts the frames together. But this lets us quickly visualize sort of what we see in the data. We can then do sort of a nice plot where we're able to see sort of all of the frames shown together. Then we can press sort of commit on our notebook. Go start session. So sometimes the commit button doesn't work. And then you have to go to restart session and then click commit again. And then you're able to sort of see the outputs. And so now you can click commit again. It will run from the beginning. We can then look at the outputs. We can go to the aluminum pre-processing, and we'll see output here. And we can see that we have the track bubble files, we have the JSON, and then we have this output visualization where we can actually see how the bubbles are moving over the course of the experiment. So you've got some sort of wild bubbles around the outside, but most of the bubbles stay more or less in the same positions. And so we can start to track them over the course of the experiment in the next part of this sort of live coding session.